Hi, everyone, and thank you so much for listening to the Facilities in Focus podcast. My name is Mackenna Moralez, and I am the Associate Editor of Facilities Net and your host. Today, I am joined by Doug Thornton, Executive VP of Stadiums and Arenas at ASM Global. In his position, Doug oversees 150 facilities in North America, including 7 NFL stadiums. During his 27-year tenure with the company, he has helped to attract, host, and produce numerous major special events while being involved in other key aspects of the sports and entertainment business. Doug also led the unprecedented $225 million renovation and reopening of the New Orleans Superdome in 2006 after it was destroyed by Hurricane Katrina. The project was widely viewed by the industry as the largest stadium reconstruction project in American sports history and was credited for playing a significant role in the city's recovery. Thank you so much for joining us, Doug. How are you today?
I'm doing great, McKenna. Thank you very much. Pleasure to be with you.
Thank you. So your bio kind of explains a little bit of what we're talking about today. And I know that we're kind of in like a time machine bubble right now, but 2025 is the 20th anniversary of Hurricane Katrina. And for those who don't know or don't remember, I guess it was so long ago, Hurricane Katrina was a Category 5 hurricane that struck New Orleans and its surrounding areas, causing 1,392 deaths and damages worth $125 billion. During the hurricane, the New Orleans Superdome was used as a public shelter for the third time in its history. Approximately 10,000 residents and 150 National Guardsmen sheltered in the facility on the first day. It was opened up to the public, eventually reaching upwards of 20,000 residents as search and rescue teams brought on more people from areas that were hit hard from the flooding. And you were there, right?
Yes, it's hard to believe it's been almost 20 years since Hurricane Katrina.
Yeah. What are your thoughts as the Superdome reaches the 20th anniversary?
I guess my initial thought is just how far we've come since that terrible tragedy. We just completed a $550 million modernization of the stadium. It was a major transformation of a great asset here in New Orleans, and basically has helped sort of redefine the lifespan of the Superdome that was on life support, if you will, 20 years ago after Hurricane Katrina. And now look at it, here we are about to host another Super Bowl, which I think will be our 7th in the stadium on February 9th, 2025. And just the thought of how far we have come gives me a lot of pride and joy, and really just makes you feel good that we've been able to continue on here.
That's really great to hear. How did you feel when you heard that the Superdome was being opened up for shelter again?
Well, as you pointed out, it was the third time that it was used as a refuge of last resort. And that's a defined term, by the way. Refuge of last resort is a point in time when the roads, the public roads and streets are shut down by the law enforcement officials, and there's a sort of mandatory shelter in place. Refuge of last resort means it's a location where people who feel their lives are in danger can come to during the hurricane, when it's bearing down, when there's no other way out of town. So this was really the third time that we had opened the building as a refuge of last resort. And I think what's different about Katrina than the previous two times that we had opened, Hurricane George in 1998, and I think it was Hurricane Ivan in 2004, just the year before Katrina. Both of those were Category 3, Category 4 storms that were on a similar track to basically have New Orleans as a bullseye. The difference was in 1998 and in 2004, we never lost power, we never lost water pressure, and the people that were here were only here for a short period of time, anywhere from 12 to 24 hours.
Right.
So it was, I always joke, it was like an experiment that government officials tested, and it seemed to work.
Mhm.
Because the Superdome is, the parking decks, the parking garages are elevated. The Superdome Plaza is elevated above street level, and as most people know, the city of New Orleans, by and large, is about 6 feet below sea level. So
Right.
we're in a basin, if you will, the entire city. So you have to pump the water out when it rains, and
Mhm.
pump the water into these canals, and the canals outflow into the lakes and into the river, that allow us to keep a differential, if you will, between the water that's building up inside the bowl and what's outside the bowl. So, um, I guess my thinking back on it, my thought about opening the Superdome as a refuge of last resort during Katrina, um, instinctively, I felt it was different because of the magnitude of the storm.
Right.
Um, I remember uh, the sequence of events that led up to the decision by government
Mhm.
officials to declare it to be a refuge of last resort. I'll take you back just for a moment in time and explain what transpired. We had a football game here on Friday night. It was a preseason game. It was the Saints against the Ravens. I remember because the storm at that point in time was just making its way across the southern tip of Florida and
Right.
into the Gulf of Mexico. And even though we were never designated to be a shelter for
Mhm.
mass population, we did have an agreement with the city of New Orleans to shelter in place certain medical special needs patients. So
Right.
we were already beginning to plan for that as part of our hurricane preparedness. We were clearing out our club lounges, which are on the second level of the Superdome, elevated very high above grade, to prepare to bring these medical special needs patients in. But we thought that was going to be the extent of it. We didn't know that we were going to wind up literally housing what turned out to be over 30,000 people for more than 5 days, almost 7 days, actually.
Mhm.
Um, so as we were preparing for it on Friday night in the overnight hours leading into Saturday, the storm is now making its way into the Gulf, and they're predicting it's going to accelerate in terms of wind speed to a category 4. And we know that by the time we wake up now on Saturday morning, it's in the Gulf, and it's the winds are at category 4, approaching category 5. So it was probably mid-afternoon that day when we got the call from the city officials, who said that they were in discussions with the National Weather Service, and the National Weather Service was fearful that the tidal surge would be so significant that it would overtop the levees. The levees are 18 feet high in New Orleans East, and they were afraid of a tidal surge that would be over 20 feet. Uh, and it would cause severe flooding in areas of the city, particularly the Ninth Ward, St. Bernard Parish. And as a result, they wanted to move people into the Superdome as a refuge of last resort. And of course, at that time, they hadn't announced it publicly, but they were calling us so that we could get prepared. And of course, as a state facility, we needed the governor's Office of Homeland Security to authorize that. So
Mhm.
by 5 o'clock that afternoon, um, the plan was set that we would open the next day at 12 noon on
Right.
Sunday. And so that's the sequence of events that led up to uh, us declaring it as a refuge of last resort. But instinctively, this hurricane felt different than the ones before. I don't know why, but I think everybody had that sense that this was the big one. Okay.
Yeah.
And, we had dodged the bullet a couple of times with previous storms, but in sort of glancing blows. But this was a massive storm brewing in the Gulf. And it was it was moving so quickly, you know, I mean,
Mhm.
between Saturday morning and Sunday evening, we didn't have a lot of time to prepare. So it was a very quick, accelerated, uh, situation.
Right. How do you stay calm? Because even you just talking about it made like my chest feel really tight. So,
Well, I was I wasn't very calm. I was very nervous. There were
I mean,
so
that's
many
fair.
things. Well, you again take you back before the hurricane hit on that Sunday. As we were preparing, we remember there was a mandatory evacuation on
Mhm.
that Saturday. The storm started making landfall in the early morning hours of uh, what was Monday.
Right.
And if you go back to Saturday, there was a mandatory evacuation that was ordered, and people were literally that evening. Well, they had both lanes open, the contraflow, pushing everybody out towards Baton Rouge to the west, and same thing to the east towards Slidell and Mississippi. So uh, I was very nervous. So all of our employees, except for essential employees, had evacuated. And we
Right.
have, because we're a major asset here owned by the state, and we were going to house the medical special needs patients. We had just a small core of individuals that were here. I think it was 18 total personnel, some of whom are security personnel that we employ, others that were engineering employees that run our central plant, our chillers, and our electricity,
Mhm.
and then some of the executive team. Everybody else had evacuated and left town. So, yeah, it was a difficult period of time when the state officials called me and said, we want to open the dome tomorrow, meaning Sunday at noon, as a refuge of last resort. My first instinct was, you got to give me some time to get prepared for that. And
Mhm.
I need support. I need the National Guard here to be able
Right.
to help us manage the inflow, the intake of police, because you can't just open the door and say, okay, everybody come on in. We had to have some protocols to that. We typically
Right.
would do security screening because people are coming in from, it's like we would for a football game. We're going to make sure they're not bringing contraband, any
Mhm.
firearms, because they're going to be here for potentially an extended period. So it was it was very, very nerve-wracking that first 24 hours getting ready to open up, the Superdome on Sunday uh, at 12 noon.
Yeah. Did you sleep at all?
I didn't really. I think I got maybe 3 hours of sleep in the overnight hours between um, Sunday evening and Monday morning when Katrina made landfall. And then it was pretty much the same way from that point forward. It was maybe an hour or two each day. And I'm not joking, an hour or two, because there were two reasons. One, there was so much going on in here that we had to pay attention,
Right.
to trying to just keep the population alive and,
Mhm.
and, and making sure we had some semblance of order. And number two, it was so hot. It was miserably hot. Inside
Mhm.
the building, we had no functioning HVAC. We had no power except for generate. We're running on generated power, and we can talk about that later. We almost lost generated power because of the fuel tank being underwater. So it was just miserable. So you couldn't sleep. It was wet. We had lost, 75% of our roof membrane and
Mhm.
water dripping everywhere. So no, I didn't sleep very much.
Yeah. I can't even imagine. Oh, I can't imagine how you like get over something like that either. Just like the mental stress of it. Oh man, Hurricane Katrina was one of the first things that I actually like really remember. It happened when I was 10, and that was seeing my parents just glued to the television screen. And I'm in Wisconsin, it's just knowing how big of an impact that was and how kind of pop culture shifted with it, with all like the campaigns that happen on TV. Like I'm pretty sure American Idol, that's when they started to do their Idol Gives Back, and it happened for Hurricane Katrina, and just seeing how the world kind of rallied around to help New Orleans.
Yeah, and you know what? We are so appreciative of that. There were so many people from around the world that contributed to the rebuilding of New Orleans, and um, it's kind of funny because the Superdome was the epicenter of that tragedy because
Mm.
it was seen on uh, television news outlets throughout the world.
Right,
And when people uh, when they thought of Katrina and they thought of the images of Katrina, they thought of the misery and suffering that occurred here, and they associated that entire tragedy with what happened here. And
right,
that's why it was so important for us to come back and rebuild the Superdome, because we did not want that to be the lasting image, of this wonderful facility's, legacy.
right. So you were at the helm of the rebuilding. What was that process like?
Well, it was very challenging. We didn't even know that it could be rebuilt until probably about a month after Hurricane Katrina. You have to
Mhm.
remember, we lost 75% of a 9.6-acre roof, which allowed massive water intrusion inside the building. Almost every square inch of the facility was either damaged by the storm, wind damage, and rain, or from being occupied for 7 days by evacuees with no running water, no functioning toilets, very minimal provisions. It was it was absolutely ripped apart, okay, from the inside out.
Right,
Just because it was just difficult. I mean, and just it was as bad as you can imagine and worse than that, okay? So it wasn't until probably 2, maybe 3 weeks after the storm that we could get engineering crews in here to actually assess the damage. And the reason for that, if you remember, we had Hurricane Rita that
oh,
hit
right after.
10 days after Hurricane Katrina, which flooded the city again. So no one could get in the city. It was being protected at the time by, the National Guard. We actually had the 82nd Airborne right here at the Superdome because the National Guard headquarters at St. Bernard Parish had been flooded. So they were working out of the Superdome as their headquarters. And of course, our parking decks were used as helipads. And we had helicopters coming in every day when the storm was taking place. We had,
Mhm.
and when it was over, rather, bringing people in, rescuing them off rooftops, as you were indicating earlier. So the damage here was beyond what I could even imagine, you know.
Mhm.
And I thought when I left here that I would be leaving for the last time. When I lifted
Right.
off, I finally got out, like the fifth day when the evacuation started, and we started putting people on buses to get them out of New Orleans and move them to Houston. Um, I didn't think that it could be saved. I really didn't. But by the
Mhm.
time we got work crews back in, probably 3 weeks after Hurricane Katrina, they literally crawled the building with a flashlight, because we didn't have functioning power. We had no power.
Right.
And I remember standing outside my office on the plaza level, talking to Paul Griesmer, who was the head architect for LB Beckett. I called him to ask him to assemble the engineers to come down. And he said to me, I think it can be saved. You don't have any major structural damage other than the roof being ripped off.
Mhm.
It's going to be a question of whether your HVAC systems and the mold in the
Right.
building can be remediated and it can be restored. It's going to cost over 250 million,
Mhm.
but it'll probably take over 2 years to do it, but I think it can be done. So that was really the first glimmer of hope that we had that it could be
Right.
done. But then we had to figure out, okay, how
How?
are we going to pay for it? How are we going to go about getting the work done? Because there was no one living here at the time. We didn't know when the city was going to recover. So um, my my thought at the time was golly, that's great, but how are we going to do it?
Right, like it didn't seem believable.
It didn't seem achievable at the time, but um, anyway, that was what happened during that first month. And then in early October, October 4th, I believe to be exact, which was about a week after I had that conversation with Paul Griesmer, we had our first meeting with FEMA.
Hmm.
And of course, we were in communication with the governor's office of emergency preparedness all this time. And they were asking us what we thought. And we said, don't know. We think it can be saved. It's too early to say that it's got to be torn down. And our biggest concern was what's going to happen to our football team. Our football
Right.
team is playing in San Antonio. They're in exile. They can't come back. We don't know when they're going to be able to come back because they don't have a building to play in. They don't even have fans to go to the game because people are out, they can't rebuild their homes. So I remember having this conversation with FEMA. We
Hmm.
went to meet with them, and there were 4 or 5 of us, and they were working out of a makeshift operation in the Bon Marché Mall in Baton Rouge. And there were
Uh,
probably, no joke, there were probably 3,000 federal workers there working in under temporary conditions in this old abandoned shopping mall. So we met with the FEMA officials, and they gave us this, they call it the Blue Book. And
uh,
it's basically a how-to guide on how to get reimbursed if you have uh, uh, disasters like this, and you're trying to rebuild public facilities. We had never had any experience with anything like that before. I wasn't even remotely familiar with the Blue Book or FEMA reimbursement, so they were
right.
trying to educate us on that. And then um, on October the 11th, which was about a week after the FEMA meeting, we had our first meeting with Governor Blanco. And
Hmm.
this was a critical moment in the history of what happened. I remember going in to talk to her, and I said, Governor, the architects and engineers say that it can be rebuilt. It's going to take probably over 2 years to do it and over $250 million. But if we want our football team back, it's really the
Hmm.
only chance we have is to rebuild because we're not going to be able to tear it down and replace it. FEMA's not going to pay to replace it. And we don't have the money to build a new football stadium anyway, and it would take 4 to 5 years, and the team can't wait that long. So the only chance we have is to try to, get it rebuilt and use the FEMA reimbursement opportunity. Um, but I said, look, I understand that this is not a priority because there are other pressing needs. Just tell me to stand down. I said, just give us a red light or a green light. If it's a green light, we'll keep going as far as we can. And if we run into trouble, we'll come back and let you know. If it's a red light, fine, we'll just walk away. And to her credit, she said, you keep pressing. We have to rebuild the Superdome. We cannot
Right.
let it die. So that was October the 11th, 2005. Um, the water had just been pumped out of the city. There was no one living in downtown New Orleans or anywhere in the Orleans Parish area. And the governor had just basically said, you got to do it. So we're going to let you go as far as you can. And we run into problems, we'll work around. So
Right. Because it is like, it does bring community together, right?
no doubt about it. We witnessed that when you have a tragedy like this and everyone goes through it, it has a way of cutting through all of the what I'll call the social ills of the community. It doesn't matter whether you're black or white, rich or poor, where you live, you were impacted. Okay.
Right.
Everybody was impacted and they were in the proverbial same boat. Okay. For
Right.
once. So, uh, and I think what was so interesting about it is if you talk to the New Orleanians who lost their homes or had to rebuild or had to evacuate and come back, all they really wanted was a chance to regain what they had before. They wanted their
Right.
city back. They wanted their lifestyle back. They wanted their friends back, no matter where they lived and what their job and function was in life. They just wanted to recapture what we had before. And that had all been lost. And everybody was so afraid that it would not be the same. It would never,
Mhm.
in many respects, it's better. We were able to rebuild. And I remember people telling me, this is your opportunity to maybe rebuild the city in a different way. And sure enough, there were many, many positives that came out of that. But at the time, at that particular moment, in the early days after Katrina, it was very, very dark. But what was interesting is you're right. Everybody was in that proverbial same boat. No matter where you lived in the city, you were impacted.
Well, I just have one last question for you, Doug. And it's a little silly, but what would you go back and tell yourself 20 years ago?
What would I tell myself 20 years ago
Yep.
in the middle of the hurricane?
Yes.
Gosh, someone asked me once, would you do this all over again, knowing what you knew today? And I stopped and I thought about that. And I said, I'm not so sure I would. Um, and here's why. Um, knowing how hard it was now,
Mm-hmm.
looking back on it, I don't know if I'd want to, I just don't know if I mean, certainly you want to be able to serve your community and you want to be able to help rebuild an iconic building like the Superdome, but it was hard. And
Right.
sometimes not knowing how hard it's going to be is better. Because if you know today what it was like then, you ask yourself, would you go back and inflict that pain on yourself again? And
Right.
you have to really honestly say, I don't know what I would do. I'd like to think that I would do the same thing all over again. But
Mm-hmm.
I got to tell you, it was hard. It was tough. It was hard for not only me, but for the people who work here, for the workers who rebuilt the dome, all the people that moved back to New Orleans after Katrina. So I had to pause and think about that for a minute.
Mm-hmm. You probably wouldn't believe yourself.
Yeah, I mean, it sometimes, like I say, not knowing is better. Not knowing what you're about to
Mm-hmm.
face and the difficulty and the challenges you're going to have to overcome. Because if somebody had told me what I was about to have to do for the next year to rebuild the Superdome, I would have said, I'm not so sure I want to sign up for that.
Yeah. But
It's
you're
going to be too
resilient
difficult.
too. You're resilient too. I think you've been talking a lot about how the facility and the other workers are resilient. You are too.
Well,
You came back stronger as well.
we 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 have come back stronger as a community, and my wife and I we lost our home. We had 7 feet of water in our neighborhood. We were like everybody else. We were in exile. But we made the decision to come back. And my wife, she did a wonderful thing by creating a nonprofit called Beacon of Hope, which eventually wound up helping to sort of lead the recovery for not only our neighborhood, but for the whole Lake District area in New Orleans. So that's why I go back and think in my head that, sometimes out of tragedy comes opportunity. And
Hmm.
this was an opportunity for our community not only to reflect, but to rebuild in a better way. And I never will forget, Paul Tagliabue said something to me in the early days. It was back in October of 2005. He said, now is your chance to rebuild the dome in a better way. He said, it's your chance to make it better. He said, um, uh, it can't be the same old saints in the same old dome. This is
Right.
your opportunity. And I'm thinking, gosh, how can we do that? I mean, we don't have any money. Um, it's going to take too much time. But the more I thought about it, the more I thought he's right. This is our chance to improve it. Think about it. If your house is destroyed, and this is your chance to go from Formica countertops to granite countertops, wouldn't you do it if you could figure out a way to afford to do it? So
Right.
I'm using that as an example, but uh, that is kind of what played out here. Is it allowed us to sort of reset and reflect and build our city back in a better way. And as New Orleanians, I think we're all proud of that.
Mm. Well, thank you so much, Doug. I really appreciate you taking time out of your day to speak with me.
It was my pleasure, Mackenna.
Thank you for listening to the Facilities in Focus podcast. Facilities in Focus is a product of the facility market, which houses FacilitiesNet, building operating management, facilities maintenance decisions, and healthcare facilities today. Thank you to our sound and video editor, Paul Ellertson. Thank you to Morgan Johnson for designing our logo. Thank you to Dan Welton, Dave Lubach, Dan Hounsell, Jeff Warden, Jill McDermott, and everyone else at Trade Press Media Group. For comments, or if you are interested in being a guest on Facilities in Focus, please email us at fnpodcast@tradepress.com.